The photograph itself seemed unremarkable at first glance. Two Nazi officers standing beside a military vehicle in Poland, 1941, sharing a laugh, their faces caught in that rare moment of unguarded humanity that even monsters occasionally display. One officer pointing to something off camera, the other's head tilted back in amusement, cigarette between his fingers. A sliver of ordinary life amidst extraordinary evil. For 80 years, it remained just another anonymous image among thousands documenting the German occupation of Eastern Europe. Filed away in the Warsaw Historical Institute's archives, the photograph bore only a simple label: German officers, Łódź region, September 1941. Nothing to distinguish it from countless others. Until Dr. Sarah Levinson decided to look closer. There was something about their posture, she would later explain, something in the way they were positioned that suggested this wasn't just a casual moment between comrades. Sarah hadn't even been looking for this particular photograph. As a forensic historian specializing in Holocaust documentation at Columbia University, she'd been granted access to the Warsaw Archives in 2021 to research evidence of early knowledge of the final solution among mid-level Wehrmacht officers. The photograph had been part of a collection she'd digitized almost as an afterthought. It wasn't until 3 months later, back in her New York apartment during the pandemic lockdown, that Sarah found herself zooming in on the image during a late-night research session. I was exhausted, honestly. I'd been staring at screens for 14 hours straight. My eyes were burning, but something made me stop on this particular photo. She leaned forward, increasing the magnification on her specialized software. And then I saw it. In the background, partially obscured by the laughing officers, was a wooden building. On its side, barely visible, was a sign, and beneath the officer's feet, almost cropped from the frame, lay something the original photographer had seemingly tried to exclude. Sarah's blood ran cold. I remember sitting there at 3 a.m., my hand shaking as I adjusted the contrast, she recalled. I thought I must be imagining things. I thought I must be seeing what I expected to see, not what was actually there. She wasn't. Dr. Mikhail Sokolov peered at his computer screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. At 73, the retired forensic anthropologist's eyesight wasn't what it once was, but his analytical mind remained razor-sharp. In his small apartment in Berlin, surrounded by books and old photographs of excavation sites, he studied the email Sarah had sent him. "I need your eyes on this," her message read. "Tell me I'm not crazy." Mikhail adjusted his glasses and clicked on the attachment. The photograph expanded on his screen, now processed through Sarah's enhancement software. The Nazi officers remained the focal point, but Sarah had circled something in the background, something she had discovered when she zoomed in. The phone rang, 20 minutes later. "You're not crazy," Mikhail said without preamble when Sarah answered. His accent, a mixture of his Russian birth and 50 years in Germany, was more pronounced than usual. "This is significant, very significant." Sarah exhaled slowly. "So, you see it too, the building?" "Yes, and the sign. It's partially obscured, but those are Hebrew characters. That building was a synagogue." He paused. "But that's not all." "The ground," Sarah said quietly. "Yes. Those aren't shadows at their feet, Sarah. Those are bodies." The silence between them stretched across the Atlantic. "We need to identify these men," Mikhail finally said. "The one laughing, I've seen him before." The investigation took on a life of its own after that night. Sarah applied for emergency grant funding, citing potential evidence of previously undocumented war crimes. With Mikhail's reputation lending weight to her application, she received enough money to assemble a small team of researchers, digital forensic experts, and historians. Ilya Kazan, a digital enhancement specialist who had previously worked with the International Criminal Court, joined the team from The Hague. His expertise with photogrammetry, the science of making measurements from photographs, would prove invaluable. "When Sarah first showed me the image, I thought we'd be lucky to get any usable data beyond what she'd already found," Ilya explained. "Historical photographs, especially those from the 1940s, have significant limitations. But this one was taken on surprisingly good equipment, probably a Leica camera, which many German officers carried." Using advanced AI-assisted restoration techniques, Elia began the painstaking process of enhancing the photograph's details. Layer by layer, the image began to reveal its secrets. The synagogue in the background wasn't just any synagogue. Architectural details matched it to the Great Synagogue of Włocławek, a structure built in 1854 and one of the largest in the region. According to historical records, it had been burned to the ground in October 1941. This changes the timeline, Sarah realized. This photo was taken during or just after the destruction of the synagogue, not before. Look at the smoke still rising from the roof, but it was the bodies on the ground that haunted the team most. Initially appearing as mere shadows or debris, the enhanced images revealed the unmistakable outlines of human forms. At least 7 of them crumpled at the officers' feet. "They're laughing," Mikhail said quietly during one of their video conferences. "Standing over murdered Jews in front of a burning synagogue, and they're laughing." The horror of the image was overwhelming, but identifying the officers would prove even more disturbing. Rachel Bergman didn't understand why her grandfather had stopped eating. At 96, Solomon Bergman had survived the Holocaust, 2 heart attacks, and the loss of his beloved wife of 70 years. He had always been resilient, determined to live fully despite all he had endured. But 3 days after seeing the news report about Dr. Levinson's discovery, he had shut down. He refused food, barely spoke, sat by the window of his Manhattan apartment, staring out at nothing. "Grandpa, please," Rachel begged, kneeling beside his chair. "Tell me what's wrong." Was it the story about the photograph? Did it bring back memories? Solomon's eyes, cloudy with cataracts but still alert, slowly focused on his granddaughter's face. "I was there," he whispered. "I was there that day." Rachel felt her heart constrict. "Where, Grandpa? Włocławek?" He nodded slowly. "I saw them take the picture. I was hiding in a cellar across the street. I saw everything." His hands trembled as he reached for hers. "The man they're trying to identify, the one laughing." His voice broke. "His name was Klaus Schmidt, and he found me the next day." Sarah couldn't believe the email that appeared in her inbox. It had been forwarded through several channels. First the university, then the Holocaust Memorial Museum, and finally, to her. "Dr. Levinson, my name is Rachel Bergman. My grandfather, Solomon Bergman, is a survivor of Włocławek. He has identified one of the men in your photograph as Klaus Schmidt. He says he was an SS Hauptsturmführer who personally oversaw the destruction of the synagogue. My grandfather has never spoken about this before, but your discovery has changed something in him. He says he has information about Schmidt that was never documented. He wishes to speak with you as soon as possible. He is very elderly and not well. Please contact me at your earliest convenience." Sarah stared at her screen, her heart pounding. They had been trying to identify the officers for weeks without success. The laughing officer, the one Mikhail thought he recognized, had remained frustratingly anonymous. None of their facial recognition searches had returned conclusive results, and now a living witness had come forward. She picked up her phone with shaking hands. Solomon Bergman sat rigidly in his armchair, his thin frame nearly swallowed by the cushions. His apartment was warm and filled with photographs, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, a family that by all odds should never have existed. Sarah sat across from him, recorder in hand, while Rachel hovered nearby, watching her grandfather with concern. "I need to show you something first," Solomon said, his voice stronger than Sarah had expected. "Rachel, bring me the box." Rachel retrieved a small wooden box from the bookshelf and handed it to her grandfather. With trembling fingers, he opened it and removed a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. "I have carried this for 80 years, he said. "I have never shown it to anyone. Not my wife, not my children, no one." He carefully unfolded the paper and handed it to Sarah. It was a photograph, smaller, grainier than the one she'd found in the archives, but unmistakably taken moments before or after. The same officers, the same burning synagogue, but from a slightly different angle. "How?" Sarah whispered, staring at the image in disbelief. "The photographer took many pictures that day," Solomon explained. "They were laughing, posing, proud of what they had done. This one fell from his pocket when they left. I found it when I came out of hiding." Sarah looked up at him, questions flooding her mind. "Mr. Bergman, this is extraordinary evidence. But you said you recognized one of these men. The officer on the left?" Solomon's face hardened, a glimpse of the young man who had endured unimaginable horrors breaking through his elderly facade. Klaus Schmidt, he said, nearly spitting the name. SS Hauptsturmführer Klaus Schmidt, but that wasn't his real name. Sarah leaned forward. What do you mean? His real name was Karl Schwarz. He was born in Włocławek. His father was Jewish. The silence in the room was absolute. The man laughing as the synagogue burned, Solomon said, his voice dropping to a whisper, was born Kalman Schwarzberg. We went to school together as boys. Word count. 1092. In the soft light of Solomon's apartment, Sarah struggled to process what she'd just heard. The implications were staggering. A Jewish man who had become a Nazi officer, participating in the destruction of his own community. Are you certain? She asked, her voice barely audible. Solomon's eyes flashed. As certain as I am sitting here. We were friends until we were 12 years old. His father owned a watch shop on Tumska Street. They were not very religious, but they were Jews nonetheless. He paused, gathering his thoughts. When the political situation began to change in the early 1930s, they converted to Catholicism and changed their name to Schwarz. Then Karl Kalman went to university in Germany. When he returned in that uniform with that new name, I wouldn't have recognized him except what? Sarah prompted gently when he trailed off. He had a scar on his left hand between his thumb and forefinger. We were children, playing with his father's tools. He cut himself on a metal file. The scar was distinctive, shaped like a crescent moon. Solomon's gaze drifted to the photograph in Sarah's hands. If you look closely, you can see it even in that picture. Sarah immediately reached for her phone, texting Ilya. Need extreme enhancement of left officer's left hand, looking for a crescent-shaped scar between thumb and forefinger. What happened after this photo was taken, Mr. Bergman? She asked, returning her attention to Solomon. The old man closed his eyes. They burned the synagogue with 23 people inside. I heard their screams from my hiding place. The bodies you see in the photograph, those were the people who tried to escape. They were shot as they ran out. He opened his eyes, now glistening with tears. The next day, Schwarz led a house-by-house search. They found me in the cellar where I was hiding. Sarah held her breath, afraid to interrupt his flow of memory. He recognized me immediately. I saw it in his eyes. He knew exactly who I was. Solomon's voice grew softer. He looked at me for a long time. The other soldiers were waiting for orders, and then he said, "There's no one here. This house is clear." Rachel gasped quietly from where she stood. "He saved your life," Sarah whispered. Solomon nodded slowly. "Yes." And then he leaned close to me and whispered, "Run tonight. Don't ever come back." That night I escaped to the forest and eventually joined the partisans. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes suddenly fierce. But do not mistake this for an act of redemption. This same man had just murdered dozens of Jews, our neighbors, our friends. Saving one life does not balance that scale. When Sarah returned to her hotel that evening, her phone was flooded with messages from Ilya. "You won't believe this. The scar is there. Exactly as described." Attached was an enhanced image focusing on the officer's hand. Between thumb and forefinger was a distinct crescent-shaped scar, exactly as Solomon had described. "But that's not all," Ilya's next message read. "We've confirmed the other officer's identity through military records. Gerhard Müller, assigned to the Einsatzgruppen units in Poland, known for his brutality." The final message sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Most importantly, I found Schwarz in post-war records. Sarah, he survived the war, and according to immigration documents, he came to America in 1951. The revelation that Klaus Schmidt, born Kalman Schwarzberg, had not only survived the war, but had emigrated to the United States, sent shockwaves through Sarah's team. The following morning, she convened an emergency video conference with Mikhail Elia and two additional specialists, Dr. Hannah Weiss, an expert in post-war Nazi immigration from the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and Robert Chen, a former FBI investigator specializing in historical war crimes. "We need to proceed with absolute precision," Hannah warned, her face grave on the screen. "If this man is still alive, he would be approximately 105 years old. Extremely unlikely, but not impossible. More likely we're looking at his descendants, who may have no knowledge of his past." Robert nodded in agreement. The documentation Elia found shows that Schmidt entered the US through Operation Paperclip, the program that recruited German scientists after the war. He's listed as a chemical engineering specialist whose expertise was vital to national security interests. In other words, Mikhail said bitterly, the Americans overlooked his Nazi past because they wanted his knowledge. It happens more often than we like to admit, Hannah sighed. But the question now is, what happened to him after he arrived? Did he build a new life? Are there children, grandchildren who never knew the truth? Sarah glanced down at her notes from her interview with Solomon Bergman. According to the immigration records, Schmidt settled in Newark, New Jersey, under the name Klaus Schmidt. No reversion to his original name, no acknowledgement of his Jewish heritage. She looked up. I think we need to find out if he has living descendants. They deserve to know the truth, however painful it might be. And the world deserves to know this story, Elia added quietly. A Jewish man who became a Nazi officer, participated in atrocities against his own people, and then escaped justice by coming to America. This challenges every simplistic narrative about perpetrators and victims. Sarah nodded slowly. I agree. But we proceed carefully, ethically. These are real lives we're about to upend. 3 days later, Sarah stood on the porch of a modest suburban home in Montclair, New Jersey. The garden was meticulously maintained, with late summer roses still blooming along the walkway. A wind chime tinkled softly in the afternoon breeze. She rang the doorbell, her heart pounding. The woman who answered was in her early 60s, with salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She wore reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and had the calm demeanor of someone comfortable in their own skin. Dr. Levinson, she asked, extending her hand. I'm Margaret Schmidt-Brennan. Please come in. The interior of the home matched its exterior, tasteful, orderly, with family photographs lining the hallway. Sarah followed Margaret into a bright living room where tea had been set out on a coffee table. I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me, Sarah began, settling onto the sofa, especially given the unusual nature of my research. Margaret smiled slightly as she poured tea. When a historian contacts you out of the blue saying she's researching your family history, it certainly piques one's curiosity, though I must admit I'm puzzled why my grandfather would be of interest to a Holocaust researcher. Sarah took a deep breath. Mrs. Brennan, what do you know about your grandfather's life before he came to America? Margaret handed Sarah a cup of tea before taking her own seat. Not much, honestly. Grandpa Klaus didn't talk about the old country. My father said he'd lost his entire family in the war, that they were killed when their city was bombed. He was a chemist who came to America for a fresh start. She tilted her head thoughtfully. He was a quiet man, kind to me as a child, but reserved. He taught me chess and how to identify constellations. Her expression grew curious. Why? What have you discovered? Sarah set her teacup down carefully. Mrs. Brennan, I've found evidence that suggests your grandfather's history may be significantly different from what you've been told. She paused. This may be difficult to hear. Would you prefer I proceed directly? Or would you like me to explain how this information came to light? Margaret's expression grew serious. I'm a retired high school principal, Dr. Levinson. I've learned that difficult truths are best approached head-on. Please tell me what you found. Sarah opened her laptop and turned it to face Margaret. On the screen was the enhanced photograph, the 2 Nazi officers laughing in front of the burning synagogue, the bodies visible at their feet. This photograph was taken in Włocławek, Poland, in September 1941, Sarah explained gently. We have identified the officer on the left as Klaus Schmidt, who was born Kalman Schwarzberg to a Jewish family in that same town. Margaret stared at the image, her face draining of color. For several long moments, she said nothing, her eyes fixed on the screen. This can't be my grandfather, she finally whispered. There must be a mistake. We've verified his identity through multiple sources, Sarah said quietly, including a survivor who knew him as a boy and witnessed this event. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for her tea, then withdrew without taking it. You're telling me my grandfather was a Nazi officer, and that he was Jewish by birth? Yes. And these, on the ground, these are... Yes, Sarah said softly. They are. Margaret abruptly stood and walked to the window, her back to Sarah. Her shoulders were rigid, her hands clasped tightly behind her. My father adored him, she said, her voice hollow. He spoke of Grandpa Klaus as the model of dignity and intelligence. We have his photographs on our walls, his books on our shelves. She turned back to Sarah, her eyes now filled with tears. My son is named after him. In the days that followed, Margaret's world unraveled and reformed around this terrible new knowledge. Sarah connected her with Solomon Bergman, an encounter that proved both devastating and strangely healing. I needed to meet you, Margaret told the elderly survivor, sitting beside his armchair and holding his papery hand in hers. I needed to hear from someone who knew him before. Solomon's cloudy eyes studied her face. You have nothing of him in your features, he said finally. Kalman had sharp cheekbones like blades, a narrow face, but perhaps something in your eyes. The color is similar. What was he like? As a boy? Solomon was quiet for a long moment. Clever, very clever with mathematics and science. He could take apart a clock and put it back together perfectly, a skill learned from his father. His gaze drifted to the window. He was not cruel as a child. That came later. That was a choice. Margaret bowed her head. I don't understand how anyone could make such a choice. Fear, ambition, survival. Solomon's voice was surprisingly gentle. Germany in the 1930s was a place where being Jewish meant death, but being useful to the Reich meant power. Some broke under that pressure, but to participate in this, Margaret gestured to the photograph that now lay between them. Yes, Solomon agreed, that goes beyond fear or survival. That required something else, a deliberate abandonment of humanity. He looked directly at Margaret. But remember, he did save me. One small act that does not redeem him, but perhaps suggests he was not entirely lost. Does it comfort you? Knowing he felt some regret, Solomon considered this. No, he said finally, what would comfort me is justice. But it is too late for that now. The story broke worldwide 3 months later, after exhaustive verification and careful preparation of all involved parties. Sarah's research team published their findings in an academic journal, accompanied by a feature in the New York Times. The enhanced photograph, with the victims' bodies respectfully blurred, appeared on front pages globally. The revelation of a Jewish-born Nazi officer who had escaped to America through Operation Paperclip sparked intense debate among historians, ethicists, and the general public. It raised uncomfortable questions about identity, complicity, and the gray areas of history that resist simple categorization. For Margaret and her family, the revelation necessitated a painful reckoning. Klaus Schmidt had died in 1986, taking his secrets to the grave. The man they had known, the grandfather who taught chess and astronomy, the father who worked hard to provide opportunities for his children, was real. But so was Kalman Schwarzberg, who had betrayed his heritage and participated in atrocities against his own people. I feel like I'm mourning two people, Margaret confessed to Sarah over coffee, 6 months after their first meeting. The grandfather I thought I knew, and the man he actually was. I'm angry at him. I'm heartbroken for him. Sometimes I think I hate him, and yet you still love the person you knew, Sarah finished for her. Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. Is that wrong? I don't think there's a right or wrong way to process something like this, Sarah said gently. History isn't just academic for you, it's deeply personal. On a crisp autumn day in 2022, a small gathering took place in Włocławek, at the memorial site where the great synagogue once stood. Solomon Bergman, now 97 and frail but determined, had made the journey from New York with Rachel and other family members. Margaret was there with her husband, son, and daughter, the first time any of them had visited their ancestors' birthplace. Sarah watched from a respectful distance as Solomon and Margaret stood together before the memorial plaque, two people connected by a terrible history neither had chosen. Solomon's great-grandson and Margaret's son, both young men in their 20s, stood side by side, occasionally exchanging quiet words. Rabbi Levi Goldstein, from the small but resilient Jewish community that had reformed in Włocławek after decades of absence, led a simple ceremony. Prayers were said for all who had perished there. Names were read aloud, 23 souls who had died when the synagogue burned. And then, in a moment that had been carefully discussed and agreed upon beforehand, Margaret stepped forward. In her hands was a small wooden box containing her grandfather's military decorations, photographs, and the American citizenship papers he had received in 1958. "These artifacts of Klaus Schmidt's life do not belong to my family," she said, her voice strong despite her tears. "They belong to history, to truth, and to the memory of those who suffered because of his actions." She placed the box in a small hole that had been prepared at the base of the memorial. Solomon came forward next, gently placing the photograph he had carried for 80 years, the one that had fallen from the Nazi photographer's pocket, on top of the box. As the hole was filled and a new plaque installed, one that told the complex, painful story of Kalman Schwarzberg, who became Klaus Schmidt, Sarah thought about the power of a single photograph. How the frozen moment of two officers laughing had, 8 decades later, brought together the descendants of perpetrator and survivor in a shared act of remembrance and truth-telling. Margaret's son stepped forward and placed a stone on top of the newly installed plaque, following the Jewish tradition. In a quiet voice that nonetheless carried in the stillness, he said, "My name is David Brennan. I was named after my great-grandfather, Klaus Schmidt. Today I reclaim his birth name, Kalman Schwarzberg, not to honor him, but to acknowledge the truth of who he was and what he did. I will carry this name as a reminder that we must always choose humanity over hatred, courage over complicity." Solomon reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on David's shoulder. No words were needed in that moment of connection. The past acknowledged, the future still to be written. Later that evening, as the group shared a quiet dinner in a small restaurant near the town square, Sarah found herself sitting beside Solomon. The elderly survivor seemed exhausted but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been set down after being carried for far too long. "You know," he said softly, looking around the table at the improbable gathering of these intertwined families, "for 80 years, I've wondered why he saved me that day. Just me, when so many others died. I used to think perhaps he felt some connection to our childhood friendship, some flicker of his former self. And now," Sarah asked. Solomon's gaze settled on Margaret's son, David, who was deep in conversation with Rachel's daughter. "Now I think perhaps he wanted at least one witness to remain, one person who knew the truth of who he had been and what he had become." He turned to Sarah with a sad smile. "Truth finds its way to the surface eventually, Dr. Levinson, even when buried under 80 years of silence." Sarah thought of the photograph that had started it all, two officers laughing in a moment of casual cruelty, unaware that their image would one day become evidence of their crimes, a catalyst for truth, and, in its own way, a path to a kind of justice that transcended courtrooms and prison cells, a justice of remembrance, of acknowledgement, of refusing to let history remain comfortably buried. "Yes," she agreed, watching as past and present, perpetrator and victim, loss and hope all converged around a single table. "The truth always finds its way home."